All right. Well, hello, everyone. This
Hi.
is Trip, and I'm here with Casey. And Tim is currently, there he is. He was restarting his computer. Excellent. There he is. There's Tim Whitaker, who restarted his computer because he couldn't hear us. And he seemed confident that the restarting of the computer was the solution.
He did.
But while he's figuring that out, now we can't even hear him. I just really feel good that this is one time where Tim doesn't know how to use the internet, as opposed to me calling him and being like, how do you do this? How do you, what is the Instagram? What's an algorithm?
I have fixed it. I have fixed it. Oh, we're
Hey!
live. Oh shit, we're live. I'm not gonna. You know what? I will. Trip? Can I tell your audience how absolutely dumb I was a second ago?
Oh, you can. It's a moment of confession.
Yeah, tell us all about it.
Give me a pad key of A, please. I want to confess some sins here. So I'm, I have like this setup. I'm trying to get things working, and it's there we go. Thank you. And I'm like, what the heck? My audio is not working. Whenever I plug in my headphones, I have no audio. But if I unplug it, it plays through my Mac Mini. If I AirPlay it to my laptop that's here, it plays through that, but not through the Mac Mini. I restart the computer. I'm trying different things. I rip out my other headphone jack. My computer was muted. I was on mute the whole time.
Classic.
It was just muted the whole time.
I hit the unmute
Tim, button.
Is it muted?
So,
well, apparently
here I am.
Apparently, I just knocked my camera off. So
oh no, Trip is now frozen.
I have no idea. I hit something.
We are off to a great start.
I'm feeling a demonic depression.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I actually think
I agree. We are
the most coherent explanation.
We're worshiping the wrong gods, clearly.
Worshiping, yes.
Yes, as Casey said in her brilliant lecture.
The gods of technology are not pleased.
See what we get. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well,
poor
all right.
Trip.
Well, yeah, I guess I'll just come back in and out. I have no idea. I think I just hit a chord.
Well, is the live going to end if you leave this?
No.
Good question.
Okay. Hey, me and Casey can hold it down. We're pros.
We can hang out. Yeah,
we're chill.
We're cool.
All right. I just was really enjoying not being the technological failure in the group. And this is maybe the Holy Ghost needed to humiliate me.
Pride comes before the fall. Yeah.
All right. Well, Casey, Tim has a long history as a worship leader. So, I'm sure he's got an avenue into this.
I was a professional drummer in that space for a lot of years. That's what I did. So, yeah.
And how looped in were you into these sorts of conversations, Tim? Like as the drummer, I'm always curious.
I wrestled with this my entire time being in these spaces. I'm like, are we just giving people a sugar rush? Is this like an emotional high? But there's also like the sense of like humans tend to use music to worship, so that's not inherently bad. And you have the paintings of the Catholic Church that kind of give something to the unseen that is seen, and like we have our modern day version of that. I was one big ball of tension because as a professional musician, I was playing in a pretty professional space, and we were using. I mean, right now I'm using my in-ears or molds. I had I loved nerding out on all the technology. I loved playing it. But there was like this side of it where it's like, is this all that worship is? Like, are we just creating these moments that people are claiming to be delivered, or, hey, the chain of insert struggle was set free or was broken, only to repeat the same cycle a few days later? Like, I really wrestled with that big time for my entire 20-something years of doing that, So, yeah, I will tell you, confession, I miss playing it though. I miss the music. Rhythmically, it's a drummer's dream music to play. It's fun. It's dynamic. It's just these environments, like you feel like you are doing something that's bigger than yourself. You feel like you are interacting with the divine in a very unique way. You feel like what you're doing on a stage is really is impacting the real world, you know? And so there's a lot to it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that collective effervescence is so powerful as a reality,
Yes.
which is why asking these questions about God's justice and worship is so important, because I mean, from Augustine and others, they articulate historically, like, how do I engage music? Like, I know it's powerful, but also powerful in a bad way.
Right. And like, you know, like, okay, so I mean, I don't want to, maybe we'll just kick off with this. So I am someone who grew up in that space. I deconstructed, and I kind of went from like this one, maybe extreme to the other for a bit, where it's like, well, if it's all spiritual and all powerful, now it's just all manipulation, right?
Mm,
But the reality is that music is inherently manipulative. Like all
yeah,
music is.
yeah.
It doesn't matter what you're doing or where you're going. I think though, what makes a lot of people so suspect of the modern worship industry is that what they're selling you is not true.
Mm.
Meaning, like when they sing songs like, you know, the atmosphere is changing, you were delivered. That's not necessarily a true statement, but other more secular concerts, they're very open with what they're doing. They know that they're giving you a show. They're here to entertain you for a couple hours. They want you to feel something, and they know it's not real, right? I think that's kind of why a lot of us are so outspoken now against what helped build us for so long, because we found out that like a lot of it was really, even I'll be generous and I'll say it was unintentionally, but it was still very manipulative in an unhealthy way for us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the places that might be a fun way to start is just in Casey's lecture. She begins with defining worship.
Yeah.
And I do think a lot of times when we talk about worship, in scare quotes, it is already narrowed to the form we're most familiar with,
Totally.
style of music, and then
Absolutely.
the questions that arise about worship are not like the big theological ones she goes on to address, like how the prophets are challenging the role and function of worship, or how Jesus enacts controversy around the Sabbath, or contrasting idol worship with radical fidelity that includes care for neighbor, right? Like there are these tensions that show up in the biblical text that oftentimes we end up debating worship about whether we liked it or not,
Yeah,
or whether
yeah.
it's aesthetically
Totally.
pleasing to us, or or maybe for those of us that started in more lively congregations and theologically migrated, I mostly just notice how boring mainline Protestants are in worship. But maybe you could help us, Casey, as someone who teaches liturgy and preaching, help us begin to think about worship theologically. Like, what all is at stake, and what is kind of its origin and framing, and how does the conversation around worship begin that doesn't start with, do we have drums in the sanctuary, or do we edit this line in the hymn?
Well, obviously, we do have drums in sanctuaries, to be clear.
But
So.
it'd be bad for Tim if the answer's no.
And that is worship.
The end.
No, I mean, I think I do a lot of play with words when I'm examining the theological question and looking at the sort of artifacts that we have from scriptures and early church, and trying to capture this phenomenon, right, or this way of wiring and being together in the way of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And so what you find, first of all, I always, oh, there's an echo. Is that, am I just
That's me.
me?
Hold on. I'm sorry. I have an
Okay.
issue. I'm done. It's fixed.
Technology gods. What I find and what my students see as we journey into this picture is, one, there's so already embedded, like culturally, so much play with the very words that we just inherently use for worship. Meaning, when the early church was playing with notions of sacrament, right? That is a word and a practice that existed before Christians were defining the sacraments, and it was about oath keeping, oath making a pledge to a power in service to that power, right? And Christians were saying, well, we don't take an oath and make our devotions to the empire or to Caesar. Our oath and our pledge is to Jesus Christ, and now it looks like this.
Mm.
And so it's it's hard to define worship without first trying to explore and the entanglements of the early Christians who were saying, we are trying to rewire and reframe like our whole pattern of life and our way of being in the world according to what was revealed through Jesus Christ. And from that sort of mentality came initiation, right? And a development of initiation rite that was very diverse from the beginning, depending on geography and location, Western, Eastern traditions. But some of that transcontextual, transcultural nature of those rites was a definitive saying no to Satan and his pomp, and saying yes, turning to the east and accepting a pledge of allegiance to Jesus Christ, and to put it in an American sort of framework. And so worship is not just the worship hour on Sunday. And that's really hard because most people assume that when I'm teaching, like I'm only focused on that worship hour. But it is always the question of the holistic patterning of a community and how it is serving the poor, the oppressed, lifting one another up, cognizant of the needs and the cries of people in their midst, and responding as God would to cries of injustice and need for help.
By the way, Casey, this is my first time interacting with your work, and it was fantastic. It was so good. So thank you for the lecture. It was really helpful as someone who is coming out of a very evangelical framework and trying to find, different ways of being Christian and examining these things. I think, Trip, can you bring up question 1? I think this is actually a great place for this, because I've been thinking about this myself. So Sarah asked, how do we balance honoring inherited worship traditions while remaining open to prophetic critique like that found in Amos and Isaiah? And I want to give maybe a real world example of this, because as you were talking, I was like, wow, I've been taught to separate worship from the teachings of Jesus and even the Hebrew Bible of the oppressed and fighting for the oppressed. And it hit me that a few years ago in the middle of COVID, the Passion Conference, Passion City, had their huge, massive 20,000 student gathering in Georgia, right in Atlanta, right while outside their neighbors were struggling to get adequate health care and were struggling with access to COVID resources. And it struck me as a modern day example, I think, of what you were getting at in your lecture of you have these prophetic critiques that are saying, look, worship is not just, you singing these songs to me, but it's how you're advocating for the least of these. And I'm thinking about how that modern idea of this Passion Conference happens full of worship. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know, the Passion City Conference is usually where a lot of worship leaders who play will release songs for the first time, but that then kind of go viral in the church circles. So it's a very big deal. But while they're doing that, praising God for his unending love and his justice and goodness, their neighbors right outside the doors are suffering, and their mass gathering, that was unmasked, by the way, is only aiding in that suffering instead of helping it.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a praise and worship industry. I think that's part of the reality that we're embedded in, at least in North America, especially. And so the now capitalism is very much entangled in it, right? This industry of praise and worship music and praise and worship culture that is getting to define what praise and worship is. And I love your real world example there, because it is, to me, very much like I can see Amos standing outside going, what the hell are you doing? This is, I hate this. I hate your pomp. I hate this artifice. It stinks. Get outside and do the worship. And so absolutely, I think probably other folks can name those tensions as well. And so we've really siloed and compartmentalized, I think, what it worshiping Christian life looks like, to be just another hour that's blocked off on Sunday that we check and we do, and maybe also a midweek hour of study, and that's what it is. And so when people are like, but how do you bring Sunday into the rest of the week? It's yeah, well, we start by what's our education? Like, what's our catechism? Are we really like initiating people into a holistic understanding of a life of worship and following and devoting our lives to Jesus's way?
So do you think that it's a matter of like a balance of like these modern traditions with the critique we find in the prophets, or is it a different kind of like reframing of how we think about this idea entirely? Because I empathize with Sarah deeply as someone who had that tension, still does. I mean, at some point I'm going to go back to church, so to speak, a more formal church, and I'm going to wrestle with like this idea of our modern view of worship versus what we see historically in what the prophets talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it helps to be able to articulate an example of what our modern ways of worship are. So I guess like you, Tim, I was formed in the evangelical world, and I was a creative encounters worship director.
Nice. Cool.
I
You had the
studied
flags going.
Yeah, I studied film though, so I would create film pieces for the church plant, and that's where my wrestling with why am I doing this, or what's the theological impact of this, and then someone was like, you should probably like study this stuff because you're a super nerd. But it's hard. I mean, I've seen so many different communities of worship, so you'll hear me constantly say in my responses today, like, if your question is looking for a universal answer, I'm not going to give it. I'm a practical theologian. I'm an ethnographer. I have to be on the ground in your community to articulate what countercultural practice might look like for you and what a trans contextual experience is for you. So I know that's not a great example, maybe, or answer to your question.
Well, honestly, I love that answer because, and this ties back into your lecture. And Trip, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, Trip, but I was so I love this.
I actually was glad when Casey said yes because I was looking forward to you two talking. So
okay. But you mentioned you bring up a slide of like the themes of like white supremacy and you know, either or binaries, one right answer was kind of on there. And I think that's important for us, especially for folks. I'm not sure how many of you are watching this who are maybe deconstructing or rethinking faith, but you can easily fall into like a progressive dogma and a progressive binary all over again. And so I like what you said here, Casey, of like, look, I don't have like a new ultimate answer for you because your context and your geolocation and your culture and what your church is trying to do all is going to impact what that looks like for you. So I think it's actually a fantastic answer personally.
I'm glad it has that integrity. It doesn't like sell books to be like, here are not 7 steps to a highly culturally relevant and effective church. I'll never write that book. So
that's why you're not church planning, right?
No, I am not. Yeah, but I do a lot of coaching, and so that's where I really feel like the transformation really happens is in listening to communities, listening to their leaders, and then like through asset-based networking and mapping, responding to the environment and the time. But yeah, it will be so varied depending upon our tradition that's inherited and our location and who's in power in a local congregation.
It's great. Thank you.
So one of the things that I really appreciated about the lecture that there are, especially in how you frame it and then kind of answer the question in different settings, is it when we think of worship as ascribing worth, right? That the one good God revealed in the person Jesus Christ is worthy of worship. Just to reflect on that and take a deep breath and think the worthiness of God is in some way related to our place in history, it raises questions of justice, right? Yes. And so one of the things I noticed that you did throughout the looking at the prophets and Jesus and Paul is talk about how the moment you look at these places where they talk about worship and they're thinking about it theologically, they aren't thinking, how do I get us to heaven?
No.
Right. It is the actual lived material experience of the underside that the prophets are raising up. Like, why are you charging people that you stole the land from interest on loans at worship?
Yeah.
Or you look at Jesus going like, you're enforcing laws that keep people from healing and restoration, thinking that's what God intended you to do. Or Paul's like, so I planted a church and then I get a letter that all the rich people who don't actually have to work are like, oh, we're Sabbathing the shit out of this.
We're gonna party.
We're gonna get there. By the time people get there, you're loaded, and the working class feels excluded from the table, right? And he's like, if you're just going to do that, go ahead and segregate and stay home, because it's not Christ's body. And so one of the things that those elements of both Hebrew and Christian scriptures help with is to think, then what are the questions about our present reality? That if we are going to say good news and it's not just about an escape plan, then worship is ascribing a worth to a God, but a worth to a good and loving God who desires justice for all God's creatures. And so these topics that, for a number of people voice like, I love what Casey said, but it also, how do you do this in a congregation where half of them are going to be like, what is this social justice initiative or whatnot? I wonder if you can kind of talk about, as someone who both teaches it and then works with congregations, what are some ways of making that transition to realize addressing the lived reality of the people that are gathered and are in your community is integral for a God who's worthy of worship? Otherwise, we have a God worthy of, I don't know, upper middle class white Republicans or, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard right now, right? Because as you know, like the red letters are it's like the new Jeffersonian Bible. Whatever Jesus said, actually, we don't like. I mean, there are some Christians
liberals
who
cut the
are
miracles,
explicitly saying
evangelicals cut the Sermon on the Mount.
No, for real.
So it's really challenging, and I want to acknowledge that. Like, I don't want to just be like, oh, suck it up, pastors, and I'm empathizing with you because it's wild. It's like a madness, and it's hard to even agree on what's transcontextual about the gospel when the gospel is like cut it out, as Dave Coulier would say. So I'll just start with naming that. I also encourage pastors to get out their thesaurus. So we don't have to say social justice. We can talk about the needy, the cries of the needy, right? I mean, just finding ways to root this response that is embedded in our scriptures, embedded in our traditions, in ways that aren't those hot words, keywords that are being sifted and sorted out and algorithmed and to find who the un-American Christians are. So I think that's part of that shift is not just relying upon language of social justice, but still focusing on justice by saying who's in need, who's crying out in our community, where does it hurt in our congregation, like even listening for that, because certainly even a middle class Republican Christian community is being impacted by the stripping away of healthcare, hospitals closing down in rural communities, right? The things that are poisoning us all. Does that? So
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. And so it does require, and this is another one of those answers to a question some people raised, and the great questions, but how do we do this? It takes community. It takes communal conversation, and damn, that's hard in this current polarized environment for a lot of congregations, especially if there haven't been those roundtables before and opportunities to really share what's hurting and what your joys are, and not just like we're doing this executive business session in church, but we don't know a damn thing about what's going on in our world and in our lives.
Can you say a little bit about your choice of using the imagery of choreography throughout the lecture? Because it really integrated a number of the different points, and there are a couple of the questioners that used the language back. So, anytime someone uses language that they probably hadn't heard in that context in their questions, I'm like, oh, well, that was sticky.
It was sticky. One of my very favorite architectural spaces in the United States for worship is St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco Episcopal Church. And they have the dancing Jesus icon with, I think it's 90 saints dancing around them. And part of their table liturgy is a dance with the saints. And that image has always been sticky with me, and thinking about, well, that's what worship is about. It is getting us attuned with, and this is very process theology, right? To in tune with the tune of God and God's kingdom, and as opposed to being, manipulated and choreographed by capitalism, white supremacy culture. And so I was challenged by my seminary to make the intro to worship class title more fun. And I chose to use the language, to get the students in. I chose the language of worship as choreography, which is hilarious because some people are like, wait, is this a liturgical dance class? Because I am not. And I have to say, no, read the course description.
Yeah, they're checking if under the assigned text is dowel rod and flag.
Yes. And we dance. Nothing wrong with that. But yeah, it does. It's how we move in the world. It is choreographing our movement. And I'm very influenced by Don Salyers in that way too, in this language of worship and its senses, just framing the way we live ethically in the world. And so I think choreography gets at that. And in the early initiation rituals, there is choreography that reinforces and really embodies the new way of life that I think is the Protestant Reformation was like, ew, nudity and ew and stuff and gross and trim out the art and bleh.
Getting naked for baptism is really not going to pass most churches' church policy.
No, unless it's a baby. Okay. But yeah. So that's where choreography comes in. I think it's a helpful metaphor.
How do you mentioned something that we laughed at, but as someone who's been following Christian nationalism and goes to a lot of their events, I've been attuned to for a bit. But it really is true. Like in particular, this like Christian nationalist ideal, they really don't quote Jesus ever. Like they really don't. I mean, I've heard a lot of sermons. I've talked to the pastors. I've heard what they had to say. It's usually some verses out of the Hebrew Bible that are kind of completely picked up and colonized for their, like Lance Wallnau saying that Trump has a Cyrus anointing, for example, right? Yes. But you're not going to see a Lance Wallnau figure be like, look, Jesus says to love our enemies, church. So what's it look like to love our enemies, right? Because they really want to build crosses for their enemies instead. And I think that that's a key point to a lot of this. And so what I'm wondering is, we're in a very interesting time in church history in America, and this white evangelical thing that's been growing for a long time, I think maybe we can say it's finally given birth to its final form of like, look, this is what they want, right? They want to take over, and they are steeped in this white supremacist ideology. But one of the things that white evangelicalism has done is that they've done a really effective job of capturing key parts of culture and shaping how we understand Christianity. So it's, Casey, as you're talking about worship and as you're going through your lecture and even talking now, I'm like, right, what you're saying makes so much sense, but it's so devoid of what I was taught as an evangelical, right? Yeah. So, I kind of feel like we're fighting the tide here in a lot of ways. And how do you think about these things in a cultural moment where it's quite anti-Christian culture to think about worship in this more contextual, holistic approach that thinks about the need or the needs of the sick and the marginalized as a form of worship?
Yeah. So I'll start by thinking about that industry question and the resources. And this is something I wrestle with so much. And at our seminary, I've been working on creating a specialization in modern worship music, if you can believe it, because why are all of the programs that are training folks to engage the sounds and the aesthetic of music of this time only in conservative evangelical spaces? Yep. And what, and the Protestant mainline is like, ew, icky, sacred music training happens for the organ and the piano. And I think that's part of the issue is we aren't organizing enough to create the resources for this in between, this messy in between. Like those of us who, I mean, I love music. I'm a audiophile. I go to shows all the time, and I would love for there to be an alignment with that sound and that feeling with theology. I can sing with a
Right.
solid yes. It's just that we have to find each other. Because we're going against the tide. 100% CCLI, big industry, who's
Right.
writing the songs. And so many
Right.
mainline worship leaders are like, well, it's what I have access to. So
Well, and it's what a large number of the congregants are actually listening to during the week.
oh
Right?
yeah.
Like I think one of the challenges, and there were a couple ministers that brought this up in long emails that I couldn't figure. I was like, this isn't a question. But
It's a testimony.
but there are
Right.
a couple clergy who were just like, well, I can do all I want to do. And so like if people grew up, right, if they're Gen X and younger, you were probably generationally isolated growing up, right? Like you're in children, then youth, then college, and they hope that eventually you go to real church when you grow up. And if you're in a mainline, then now you're going to boring stuff. Or if you're in evangelical context, then you're going to like the mega church as critical mass of single people your age when you get out of college. And so like if they get to a point where they join their Episcopal church or Methodist church or this kind of thing, then they're like, we want contemporary music. That's like, we never sang any of the other stuff. So we don't even know them. And they have words that aren't even SAT words in it. Like, what are you talking about? Imputed righteousness. Is that sexual or religious? So I got these, clergy going, what do you do with this? And they said, the difficult thing is if you have an engaging worship service and everything, you might modify the lyrics and stuff. But the moment that music matters to them, then they find themselves listening to a radio station that or a podcast or insert, the whole CCM industry that basically spends the entire rest of the week leveraging any positive experience that happened in worship to tell them a very different depiction of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so one of the questioners were asking, like, what do you do where the content of a particular aesthetic, if the moment you're attracted to it is just problematic? And the other was like, well, what do you do when the aesthetic they're connected to is one you don't know how to do well?
Yeah.
And then if you go look at examples, you're like, why are we going to sing a song for a guy who's like laying hands on Trump at the White House? What happens if congregants don't know? And how do you manage
Right.
that tension when you know just how easy it is to have done something well, and then there's an hour a day that those people that have connected with your congregation are being basically deprogrammed because they dug this song or whatever.
I mean, this is like the question I'm living into with so many of my creative worship deconstructing colleagues. So I think of the Converging Music Project, for example, and their meeting, I can't remember, in Ohio this October. So check out CMP. But that's an example of a community that's trying to find one another with these very concerns. So they're artists with different sounds. Some are more piano, guitar, folksy, and band based, but they're queer and they're deconstructing the ableist sort of content of some modern worship music and all of those things, and trying to share resources with one another. But it's hard to find each other because we don't have the backing of big Nashville sound CEOs and record industry folks, right? And so it's like, how can we be more collaborative and share these resources and make these resources for one another authentically? So not trying to imitate the sound of Hillsong or whatever, because you can't. But what skills and assets do you have in your community that you can lead worship music authentically?
I also think that when appropriate, you can probably reclaim some of those songs too. I
Mhm.
mean, I'll give you one example. I like practical examples because it helps me be grounded somewhere. But I won't say the church, but I was at a mega church, one of the bigger ones out there, and they were doing this thing, and they're actually they have like this thing for for parents of queer kids. And they had this event where they had a trans man on the stage, they had a married woman on the stage, and they had a gay man on the stage, and they were helping out with like, helping parents navigate that. But first they had like a time of worship. And it gives me chills thinking about it, but they're singing this song that's like, it's some CCM song. Maybe it's their own, I don't know. It's all about God's love and the beauty of God's love. But I'm watching this like queer table of people worship to it. And I'm like, oh, well, when the words match the reality, there actually is no more tension. Like, this is actually beautiful. Like when we talk about God's reckless love, and that includes all of God's creation, not just the straight white ones, right? Maybe these songs have a different kind of meaning. So, I'm not saying that that's everyone's approach, but certainly there are some songs out there that I find beautiful. What makes them feel so icky is that I know that the churches that sing them don't really mean or don't really apply those lyrics to everyone that they're singing about. And that's what's frustrating.
Yeah, that's a great example, Tim. And at the last gathering I was at with the Converging Music Project, there was a queer band reclaiming songs from CCM that probably had never had them in mind as being the ones to
Right.
sing it and lead it. And it
Right.
was so moving and powerful. And it's
Yes.
back to, again, those notions of culture and worship and
Yeah.
why it's so contextual, and that is a radical countercultural moment that is
Yes.
embodied, and a play with the culture and a subversiveness that is also really important and powerful.
Right. I mean, Trip, at beer camp last year, Flamey Grant sang "Testify to Love." I was like, I'm getting saved again. Like I'm in. I'm all in. This is beautiful. But like those kinds of moments, I just think that there's something about them. You put much better language on it than I can, Casey. But it's like there's something that's just, it's almost mystical. Like just like this is it. This is the glimpse of heaven on earth that I've been trying to find. When these songs match up, or a drag queen is singing them instead of this straight person, and these words "testify to love" actually mean something that's bigger than just the small little narrow version of Christianity that I was given.
Yeah. Okay. So, here's my like nerdy question that, I realized your lecture was already long enough, so I didn't expect you to go into this, but this is the process question.
Yeah.
So in Religion in the Making, Whitehead talking about the birth of religion, right? Like religion emerges before language. Religion emerges, and then before that there's ritual, trance, dance, like the mystical stance, singing, but like guttural noises, and it functions as a way of like both community bonding, collaboration, orientation towards flourishing, where we're starting to move beyond just our initial kin groups as those we cooperate with. And it's like in that space and the freeing up of energy because we start cooking food, that you get all this energy goes to the frontal cortex. Now we have language, and now language comes involved in it. And it's not till, a couple 100,000 years after language and more animistic, broadly religious forms that you have what we mostly think of today around religion, big gods, and post-axial revolution, the axial age, where now the big religions that have been historic are not just about the orientation of the community to reality, but the community's orientation to reality on behalf of the transcendent other, like on behalf of justice, where you get Amos, Micah, and such. And it seems to me that that there are these different pressures, and that that are going on in religion, and a lot of us that are in more mainline context, it's we get so obsessed with the rational and the reflective, we don't realize that being religious didn't involve even the potential of rational reflection for a couple 100,000 years. And if we want to, quote, trust the science, we wouldn't think, oh, that's just manipulation, and we just need sterile people in a room, and we won't let our kids come to worship until they learn how to answer the questions correctly for confirmation, and blah 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 blah, right? And it's kind of like you're cutting yourself off from spiritual technologies we evolved for, that bond us for cooperation and communal flourishing. And then you look at other parts of the church and you're like, the entire point, like why monotheism came into being, like is when we realized that there are values about reality that are transcendent of our own insular communal needs. And that the birth of saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one," and it emerges out of the Exodus, and then we cultivate narratives. That comes precisely because God, in whatever gets itself done in God, has something to say about your neighbor, maybe the immigrants in your nation. If you're a Christian, it has to do with what is demanded of you by the face of your enemy, right? And it seems that part of what is going on when we start to think about the choreography of justice is also the ways in which we think our current present legitimates alienating us from part of the past, be it the rich tapestry of spiritual technologies and experiences that we've emerged, like rituals, liturgy, dance, movement, singing, all those kinds of things. And it cuts us off from like the very gift of the religions we have, namely that fidelity to God, a God who's worthy of worship, is one who calls us to care for the neighbor and ourselves. Right. And I wonder if there's something about our present moment that is there something that helps that comes to mind in diagnosing these breakdowns? Whitehead gives funny answers and invents words that makes it complicated, so I don't want to use his language. But he has this observation, right? Like he joked about New England liberal religion, finding it odd that there are Christians who start worship services without music. And he's like, they have a high belief in the power of words, right? In these kind of things. But to me, I find that the big story of how religion evolved, and then going, what are we doing in worship? And then what does the history of Israel and the early church, how is it picking up these practices, these cognitive mechanisms and things? All those seem to be invitations that for some reason we are allergic to. Different communities are allergic to different parts.
I mean, again, like my mind goes to white supremacy culture trip. Like, how do we arrive here in this like elevation of the word and the rational? And when you follow those lines, even in sacramental theology and development from the Reformation, there's a lot of cutting the head from the body off, and either or thinking that has happened, and a privileging of the rational and a disengagement of the body. So that's where I went immediately, right? Is this resistance to trusting the body and flow and the nonverbal, and filling every single moment of worship with sound and noise, and a fear of silence, and even a fear of, again, turning to the other. That's one of the things that I'm really worried about in this moment that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, is generative AI, and the turning toward generative AI for creating liturgies, writing sermons, answering questions, when we are perhaps finding a safer outlet to get like a mirror back at us than what would actually happen if we turn to a real life functioning human being and ask the same questions and work toward goals together, designing worship together. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It's really fascinating. So like even the example, right, of both that we select our churches in taste ways, basically since the advent of the car, right? We lose the parish model that you just go to the one in your neighborhood. And then the advent of AI, both of those are like these markers on a story where the worship gathering is eliminating friction. Friction in the experience, friction in difference in the other and the neighbor and these kinds of things, and making it kind of peaceful, harmonious, like you're getting what you want in advance. And nothing about the encounters with the Holy One are frictionless.
No. No,
Like there's
Harry
a
and Mary
reason
Seeker.
awe and fear of the Lord, not fear like quaking, but like awe and the mysterium tremendum if you're chanting it in Latin.
Exactly. Yeah, it is that corporate, like, hey, you might have these chairs at home, or you saw them at IKEA and you wanted them. Come sit back, chill, relax. It's like, oh, like, how does that focus our attention on mysteries beyond this immediate narrow experience of reality, and that holy community that is of saints that are dancing above us and before us and will come after us, that we are in relationship with.
Can you break this down a little bit more? Because it's kind of a new thought for me. So, if I heard you right, Trip, what you're saying is that with some modern inventions, the car, in generative AI, et cetera, it's kind of reduced potential for difference to be among us. So we're kind of becoming more, I guess, homogenous, if that's the word, for the sake of like, well, it's more peaceful. It's more, we're together. We're kind of like, I don't really understand what the critique is.
Oh.
Is the critique that we need to be, is the critique that like difference is important and friction can actually be a healthy thing as we kind of move forward together as humanity? Or like, how do you think about that?
Yeah. Like, okay, thinking back even to last week, right, with Dom looking at the human predicament, the challenge of civilization, right? He dwelt on what are the first three questions God asks. Where are you? Where is your brother? What have you done? All of those questions, right, about whether they're capturing the human predicament, have to do with this desire for us to control our ways of relating, to control our place in the world. And so, oh, where are you? You're hiding from God. What about, is it God that is you need to hide from, or is it yourself? Or they're all this, and then you're the one that made her, right? And then Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, and it's like, where's your brother? I'm not in charge of my brother. What have you done? The ground is crying out because of the blood, right? Those questions assume the encounter with the divine is a disruptive one. It's one that, because the very character of God, because God is worthy of worship, you can be challenged and decentered. Like you don't have to have a full a sense of one's identity before God, because before God, our identity is opened up, right? I think it's why we begin worship with this a kind of praising for the gratitude of creation and God, and then we go to confession and we all confess, and we get to confess because it's in the context of grace, where the fullness of ourselves and our brokenness are named. Well, what happens when in a modern context? I mean, this really is modernity writ large, but you see the shifts at the congregational level, at least if the couple master's thesis I supervised that did the actual research are correct. When in like, say, Scotland, when I had a student do this, like the moment a neighborhood got to 30% families have a car, you get initial drop in participation, and then you get selection. Right before that, if you're walking, you walk to the church in your neighborhood. So and you're in a tradition where you don't pick your clergy, the bishop does. So that's not even a decision. The moment you can drive, now you're picking where you go, or you're picking something else, soccer or whatever. And what happens is you pick ones of the aesthetics or how you want, pick it based on what you think your needs are, right? And it doesn't mean that's not a thing. I drive extra because I don't want to vomit if I hear the sermon, by the way. So this isn't like, but notice that friction goes down the moment we have a choice for either uncomfortable encounter or sameness in security. We choose the latter. Right. Idolatry is what happens in the biblical story when we choose the latter. And the algorithm type stuff makes it even worse. Yeah. Both like, think of how we only see the people we know and want, or we see the worst version of the other side to legitimate our choices. Think of what is the most clicked page when you go to decide if you're going to visit a church. It's click out to the social media pages of the clergy, and you're checking to see if they look or think or act like you, and if you'd want to hang out with them at another time. And honestly, the best sermons I've ever heard someone I worked with week after week, is someone I did not like hanging out with any other time.
Can you please name them, Trip, on the show so we all know who it is?
Yeah, just we can listen to their sermons,
Don't
Trip.
worry,
That's
I
all.
worked with enough boring preachers that they won't know which one it was. But then the moment you then think, oh, I'm working on a prayer and there's this passage, or I'm working on this sermon, or we're trying to do this. And now the anxiety of wanting to perform the sameness of your congregation.
Yes.
Now you have a solution to it, that you can nuance everything with your generative AI and figure out how you do a prayer where you mute the demands of Amos here that fits your context. How do you do X, Y, and Z? And guess what it's eliminating in doing that? It might be efficient in time, but it's actually eliminating the time you as clergy sit there thinking about all the families and community that you pray about and go, how does this text both address me and call me out? And then how do I perform this so that there's an encounter with this word that has a potential to shake the foundations of us as a community? It's really, if the technology you're using isn't is following our most base incentives as a species, then it reduces friction with people, friction with difference, friction with holy otherness, right? And if you think of the 20th century and where everybody, regardless of what church you go to, except maybe a few, if you're like, when did European Christianity go wrong? You're like, when the Nazis were like, I love Hitler and I love Jesus, and everybody's like, that's horrible. That's horrible. Now, what happened there is the elimination in the worship context of the friction of an executed Jew as Savior and Lord from the very life of the church. And you can see there's wild things, like they edit the New Testament and translate it to make it less Jewish.
Right.
There are all these kinds of things. Now imagine every clergy can have a fine-tuned tool that helps them eliminate the friction the gospel has. Anyway, sorry, that was a long rant, Tim, and Casey probably has better examples, but
probably.
No, I was going to offer like a resource for the pastors who are out there and are trying to like say, okay, great, but how do I actually introduce this? So my mentor at Vanderbilt was John McClure, and he engaged Emmanuel Levinas's work so much in his postmodern homiletics. And two particular texts I think are must reads for this time, especially as we're moving away from friction and from actual physical encounter with people in our spiritual leadership. So one is Roundtable Pulpit, and it actually has a leadership method of developing a sermon through a roundtable, and being intentional about inviting different folks in not only the congregation, but in the community to wrestle with the text together. And from that, like, that's where the life of sermon proclamation comes about. And there's different like practices within it. And then otherwise preaching gives this sort of historical overview of how homiletics needs to shift away from just being based on scriptural authority and authority of tradition into authority that is born out of responsibility to the other and that friction of encounter. To be like, I am ruined, I was wrong, but God is here. And that's actually what preaching should be doing. So it's really, it could be helpful. I have critiques of it that I talk about because it's still the preacher getting up and then performing the snapshots of those experiences. And I question whether we actually need to have dialogical preaching, but I think it's a good place to start maybe if you're trying to change.
Can I ask a question, not to hijack the conversation, but I'm really curious to hear from you, both of you, really. And, Casey, I'm the former homeschooled, no college degree person on this call. So I represent, hopefully, someone out there who's wondering the same thing. But first of all, it's helpful to have the explanation. It makes more sense. At the same time, in our current cultural moment, one of the major critiques is that we have way too much friction. There's currently a political party that is all about friction and is all about creating, this kind of heat, so to speak, that is really causing a lot of damage to our immigrant neighbor and our queer neighbor, et cetera, right? We can go down the list. And so I'm wondering, maybe I'm still stuck in my own categories, being raised in very white evangelical spaces. So I'm happy to, kind of to be taught a way to think outside of these binaries. But I struggle with that idea of friction, because when I hear friction, I hear conflict, I hear maybe someone getting hurt. I'm also someone who has been in the online deconstruction space for a lot of years. I know how much church abuse and church hurt has hurt people. And so I'm not saying you or Tripp mean friction means abuse or hurt, but can you kind of help us parse out like a healthy version of friction and friction that maybe is not helpful at all and should be mitigated?
Yes. Real quick, Tripp, and then I know you're gonna have an awesome answer. But I wonder if the friction that's created in these harmful spaces is actually born of relationship and encounter with the other, or if it's just propping up a straw figure, a felt figure of the other, and just creating friction from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I had like my wake up call, because I was very much raised in a white suburban evangelical context, and it was going away to Chicago, the south side of Chicago, to seminary, in a place where there was no tradition majority in the seminary, that I first had like the good friction, right? Of
Right.
a humbling friction that was born out of relationship and love and concern for others who were not like me. I don't think that is where the friction is coming from that is hurting.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, the difference, and I was using tension. That here's how political philosopher means it. There's antagonistic and agonistic. Antagonistic is what you're describing, Tim. I think where you're antagonistic, so like you're actively opposing the otherness when it shows up, right? As agonistic is it is, yes, there's difference, yes, there's conflict, yes, there's tension, but it's like the resistance that happens when you're building muscle, or it is an activating friction. And what it's activating too, it actually like in like agonistic democracies is what you're going for are conversations where you preserve both the connection between the two, right? That your identity is something that can't be described without your relationship to the other. So you are connected. And this is obviously not an antagonistic one. Now you're like, no, we are a Christian nation. No, we are this, that. So your description, you are connected and different. And so that the connection with a difference is agonistic. And the assumption of an agonistic one is that where you're going to be is something that is a collaborative process because of the tension. And so in that way, the friction or the tension is holy, just like an encounter with God is agonistic. Oh, I'm an unclean man and an unclean people. What the hell do you want me to do? And then God's like, open up your mouth, fool. Psst, psst, psst. But it wasn't antagonistic, like the coal burnt his face off and Isaiah walked around the rest of the time not being able to talk. But that encounter with difference, he grew into who he was precisely by being in relationship with that which he will always be in tension with, the holy, loving one. And I think one of the things about the church, and this gets that Casey talked about this in thinking about the ecumenical element and then how we negotiate this, is so much of our worship or discussion of the life of the church is already framed by a kind of sameness that is a niche market of where you are in America and what tradition you're in and all these kinds of things. And then Casey's like, but what if there's a grace of the agonistic nature of Christ's body, where like you are a part of a body who included Paul, and he's kind of weird. if you think he's supposed to be a normal American. And it also includes Dorothy Day, who, even though she's an American, she's a Catholic. I don't think she sang praise and worship songs and would have rolled her eyes when she looked at your parking lot. Or you're a part of our friends who are Christians in Kenya and you'll never see, and yet your tax money has now been diverted. So a large number of them who've been receiving meds for HIV/AIDS are no longer getting it because of our government's decisions. And they're part of this body too, right? Like, so that, like, when it's agonistic, the difference is an invitation to an encounter with otherness that entails responsibility for the other. It's also, think of it similar, true with parenting, right? Like an antagonistic parent is like, do your freaking homework right now. I'm going to hold your hand and I'm going to force you and coerce you to do it or whatever. An agonistic one's like, look, let's think about how we're going to do this. Let's instill the virtues of learning and care for our teacher and our neighbors at school. You're helping them, but you're helping them by them coming to internalize values. And in that same process of being a good parent, you realize you internalized all sorts of stuff and they actually got to be suspect and you're reworking who you are.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think that's the difference between the two. And this is one of those places you kind of want to go, hey, I think the American church is like more bifurcated than even the early church, where, Paul's like, the hand doesn't say to the foot. And now it's kind of like the tip of the nail of the pinky doesn't say to the quick of that nail, screw you. Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you for explaining that. It's good.
There are a couple topics we haven't talked on at all.
Oh gosh, yes.
And I don't want to miss them, even though I'm enjoying this. There are 2 or 3 questions about lament and confession. I'll put Marcus's up, but there were personal side of these and collective sides. Marcus says, how can church leaders model the vulnerability needed for authentic lament and confession and worship? And then someone else said, how does confession play into being open to the call of justice? And others said, or can laments be places where we learn the needs of our community or nation or families to take a stand for justice? Lament and confession. There's Marcus's version of the question.
Yeah. So, again, some of us are in congregations and traditions where, Trip, it sounds like this is you. There is always a moment of confession after the opening sort of grounding in worship on a Sunday morning. But there are plenty of traditions and non-denominational spaces where confession isn't really happening, or if it is, it's only happening in a "I did this to you, God" kind of individualistic form.
Yes.
And I think another complicating feature is, again, if we find ourselves embedded in a Christian tradition of praise and worship where God inhabits the throne of our praises, then in order to get to worship, we have to praise. Where is there any room for lament and confession and those sort of liturgies? So again, it's very contextual, but we have a tradition of confession and lament before coming to the table, especially coming to a meal, where we make sure our relationships are right within this community. And I think because we're inherently in this human web, that will imply our seeking to be right with others, the others in the world as well. And so it's like reclaiming traditions. And if you've never had communal confession and lament and worship, maybe don't start this Sunday. But if you follow church time, there are organic spaces where these practices can be embodied, such as during Lent, in preparation, Ash Wednesday. I was in a non-denominational space where we didn't really follow the church calendar, but those are wonderful historical tools to get at what Don Salyers would call the full senses of worship, not just joy, delight, and awe, but lament and confession and telling the truth in order to have an authentic hope proclaimed.
Yeah. Oh,
I
that's
just
awesome.
can't help but think about all of those teen winter retreat nights of the charismatic pastor demanding that children walk down the aisle and lament for their own sins that have crucified Jesus personally to the cross.
Oh,
And
are
it's
we
like,
going to nail them to a cross that we've
Oh,
been burned
100%.
at the
I
side?
have burned things in fires. I have nailed things to crosses. You name
Yeah.
it, I have done it. And what's interesting about that is the concept of like being accountable for one's actions and realizing the impact can be a really healthy thing. Like that's not a bad thing to do, right? And the idea of sin and our complicity, and also at times our victimization of, like, it's complicated, right? It's just interesting because in Casey, it sounds like you and I are kind of cut from the same cloth in our tradition. We both then understand like how extreme it was and how minimal the idea of like, either a communal approach to lament or like a societal approach to lament was so foreign to our idea of confessing, right? Like we really weren't confessing our complicity in late stage capitalism, right? We weren't lamenting our complicity in white supremacy or our complicity, you name it, right? And whatever it might be. It was always personal, and it was always around like very common themes. Like, did you have sex before you were married?
As
Okay,
I say, purity culture.
Yeah.
Purity.
Did you say the F word the other day?
Wow,
Okay,
we've
you got angry at
demonstrated just
someone.
how effective purity culture is at cultivating like whole human beings that don't pass on deep conflict
yeah.
and shame.
Trip, I'll have you know, I successfully graduated from purity culture. Okay, I did it. I saved myself for marriage. Look at me. I came out just fine. Like, no, not one.
No
I don't
problem.
Think, no problems at all. No, zero.
No therapy, no counseling.
No. What's therapy? I just pray harder.
Oh,
Okay,
that
if you
therapy.
do things God's way, there is great reward at the end. So
yeah.
But it's just interesting to think about again, like how it's not that my tradition was like crazy off the mark, or that even the foundations of what they were doing was inherently bad or wrong. They were good principles, but they were so misapplied, and other things that mattered, maybe even arguably more than if you said the F word that week, right? Really went so under the radar and just were not in your orbit of concerns. That's what's interesting to me.
Yeah,
That's all I got.
This even happens in so briefly we were Catholic in my upbringing, just in time for First Communion, and me in second grade having to go confess to a priest for the first time in order to receive communion, and here I am racking my brain like, I stole gum from my mom's purse. I was mean to my sister, but it was like,
Right.
but that was the formational moment where it's like, I have to look for the problems in me, right? And it starts really early in different traditions. And so how do we understand confession more in that communal reality? Because justice takes more than any one person's effort. It is always a movement. And so I think that's why communal lament, communal confession. I love these rituals that are growing of primal screams. Like I'm part of a group in Kansas City called Mom's Rage, and we've been around for a few years. And before any of our justice events where we write letters or we organize, we do a primal scream after naming the things that we are angry about in the world, and then we dance. And again, I think it gets back trip to like the early origins of like what we did together to make sense. We can't do this alone. So how are our liturgies orchestrating that sense of worship and way of being together, or not, if we have to tiptoe on eggshells around God?
100%. Can I bring up a question? Trip,
Yeah,
I just read that I thought was really fascinating and very different. It's question number 13. Grace asks, what role should children and youth play in discerning worship practices that align with God's justice? I love this question. I would love your thoughts on this, Casey.
Oh my gosh, when I saw that, I did exclamation points. I was like, yes, Grace, thank you. As the parent of two preteens, like I love their indignation, and their sense of justice is so beautiful and pure, and injustice is so beautiful and pure. So they absolutely can and should, I think, be leaders. I mean, think about what the youth in the United States of America, if your kid is going to a school building, Are you paying attention to like the embodied anxiety, anger, and fear that they have every time they step into that building because they are fully aware of what's happening in this country with shootings at schools, right? Why aren't we giving them we don't have to insert their lament and cries into the worship service. We should amplify, like, let them speak, give them testimony, open up space and follow. And I think because we've given these concerns and cries over to politics, politicians, we aren't actually listening to the cries of the children who are actually living in this fear and this crisis today. So that's just one example. But yeah, let's listen to them.
Yeah.
They're less jaded than we are.
100%.
Okay, here's one last question. And if Tim, if you have any other things, you can go for it. But Wendy, and I had to come up with I couldn't come up with a shorter version of this question because it was a long email that mostly began with, Tim asked you a real question, Trip. I think you dodged it. And I was like, I thought I was really clear. And it was me giving an answer about process stuff. I'll read it because I couldn't get a short enough version
this
to fit
one.
it.
Oh, yes.
It was me, by the way. I emailed Trip
as
your
Wendy
pseudonym because I was so offended.
You emailed as Wendy? Okay.
Yes.
There you go. Right. How does God act? Does God intervene? Why or why not? It seems if God can, then God has horrible timing and a flawed character, hence not worthy of worship. Wendy also goes, I also think anytime I ask this question, I was told to worship more and it would work out. It also seems that Israel believed God could, and Jesus said we could move mountains. How do you process types handle this for normal people? How do you talk about divine action in prayer / worship?
That's a great question, Wendy. And as a normal person, I'm going to sit back and let the pros answer this. So
I love the implication that we're abnormal as process types.
But see, you have a practical theology degree, so you didn't come up with like ways of saying superject and prehension and that in your dissertation.
No, I had to do a little bit of that in the dissertation, but I moved into praxis. But yeah. Wendy, I love this question so much. I mean, that question is actually the question I raised in seminary as a deconstructing evangelical. And I took a God, Suffering, and Evil class with Anna Case Winters and learned about theodicy. And that's actually how I became an abnormal process type person, because it did not make sense to me that God wasn't hearing how our cries for fixing the world and healing us and not responding and letting bad things happen to good people. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think that praying it away is going to fix it. But it makes more sense to me that we human beings tend to be quite dull and distracted from the heart of God. And it makes a lot of sense to me that if we are coming together as a body and seeking to experience the presence and the wisdom of God's Holy Spirit through worship, that it's a mystery, but I do believe that over time there is a realignment and a choreography of the way we act in the world that can bring about justice and move mountains, not suddenly, but slowly and rooted in a sustainable sort of way. So I know that's not like, I won't give you fix-it answers. I'm not your here's 7 steps to move mountains in prayer type of gal as a process theologian. So yeah.
Are there 8 steps, 9 steps? I mean, how many steps?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's 77.
Okay, I'll do that then. Just give me those steps.
77 steps. One of the things you said there that the practical side of it is what role then say in worship. So when we think of systemic injustice, if we think of people unable to voice their laments because of the shame they carry, like from the intimate encounters with evil to these pressing icebergs of challenge, civilizational crisis, and everything in between, how do you see ways in which we should both, as people in leadership in a congregation, intentionally address the way a kind of interventionist vision of omnipotent power leads to a poor interpretation of history, or like how direct or helpful is it to address it pedagogically? Because I see how it shows up in, like, if you're at the hospital in a crisis and they think, well, if God wants, they can heal my kid or make sure they live, and you're like, I know this isn't the ideal time, but and so it seems that there's some kind of education and things that go there for thinking about theologically, but there's another kind of education that could happen if the choreography of worship, it's, I don't know, it's like secondhand education of sorts. Like, you don't have to attack something directly, but to be giving the language and imagination for a more collaborative and relational vision of divine action.
Yeah. So it's like, even just look at the raw material of your worship songs and words from last Sunday. And where is God? How is God being described? What are God's activities and what are ours? What are our activities? What are our responsibilities? If I think you'll find that in sort of escape hatch, very strong omnipotence sort of worship spaces, it is all God's action, and a sort of completionist, it's already been done. Like, the victory is won.
Mm-hmm.
Let's brush up our hands. We're good. We'll just live in the victory. But if you if you are seeking to re-choreograph it, then the word should be us pleading for alignment and awareness and responding and reacting to the cries of people in our community, and thanking God for God's loving presence now, right? And the empowerment of God's presence now. So I know that's not a simple answer, but I think something you could look at.
Yeah. All right, Tim. Do you have a last question or something here?
Not really. We covered a lot of ground. Oh, good. See, I knew it was a trick question.
Good.
I knew it. I knew you were just testing me.
No.
Like Jesus being tempted in the desert. No, but for real, I don't have any questions. This was really helpful, and we covered a lot of ground. I mean, Casey, you and I could probably talk for hours over, the evangelical worship side of all this. But I want to say, again, Casey, my first time really interacting with your work, it was phenomenal. I'm a huge fan now, and I really appreciate. I tell Trip all the time, I'm a very pragmatic person. Okay, like, what do we do? How do we implement this? So I really appreciate your approach, because for me, and everyone's different, but for me, if it stays up here and it goes nowhere else, it's kind of useless, because it's not changing things or making things better. So how we make these changes, or how we think about these things differently that impact the world around us, I think is so important. And so I really appreciated your lecture, and I appreciated this time with you. It was really great. And also, I love the vibe. I love your aesthetic yourself. I love the glasses, the whole look. It's awesome. It's a great vibe.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Trip. This was really fun. It flew by.
Oh yeah. And luckily we were able to get rid of the technological demons that just really, really coming at us.
Shamla Hamala,
I don't know. I just got really uncomfortable. I don't think we have anyone in charge of translating what just happened.
It's not edifying then. It's not edifying.
Oh, I think Tim was saying finally someone answered a question I've asked Trip 5 times. Where I'm just like, I think this is straightforward.
I love it. This is fun.
Yeah. You didn't have the Tim's face of like,
Okay.
I love you for who you are, not because of your clarity and compelling account on this issue.
The difference, and you're different than me, and the embody. Okay,
there
I'm tracking.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you so much, Casey. And remember, any of you that want to, that haven't already got Casey's lecture, then you could go to faithandpolitics.net, and then you'll also get some other lectures to come hang out with other friends. Next week, Pete Enns is joining the live stream.
Nice.
And which would be good, because Casey just seemed way too Christian. We need a high quality heretic.
Agreed.
And with
dry
more
humor, sarcastic Northeast humor like me. It's gonna be great.
Yeah. Plus, he's a Yankees fan, and that means I can harass him. I think
Yeah.
I might even wear my Dodgers jersey to the live stream and not acknowledge it and see.
Friction.
Wait,
Friction.
if you do that trip, and I'm not a baseball person, I'm more of a football person, but I will buy a Phillies jersey and wear that on top to really rub salt in the wound, because
Ooh,
his Yanks are, I mean, woof.
yeah,
It's bad. It's bad. It's
Yeah.
bad. So
well, all righty. Well, thank you everyone that joined live. Thank you everyone that sent questions, and
Yeah.
we will see y'all again next
wait,
week.
wait. Casey, where can folks find your work if they want to follow you? Do you have a
Jeez.
public?
Oh, yes.
I'm glad we have a real
socials?
podcaster here.
Jeez, what an amateur trip. Jesus. Go ahead.
So a couple of spaces. I'm on Instagram as @CTSig, so you can find me there, Rev Mama Hen. I also am the director of the Pause Play Center for Preachers, not cosplay, pause play. Gotta always clarify that. And we have a podcast where we talk a lot about the importance of Sabbath and games and playfulness as being a radical Christian and resisting the forces that be. So please check us out at pauseplaycenter.com. And I have a book
Ooh.
called Engaging the Gadfly that's based on my dissertation. Oh, all these books are going to fall. Oh, God. Oh, it's a tower. Where I talk about preaching in the digital age. And you can see me talk more about the need for conversational dialogical preaching in this age to resist the polarization. So that's all. Thank
Love it.
you.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm glad we didn't forget that. You passed the test, Tim. I was going to see if you remembered, and you did.
I got you, Trip.
All right.
I got to contribute somehow, you know. So
Good. Well, we'll